Today's text comes from Exodus chapter 16, verses 31 through 35. Today's title is God Provides, Letting Go and Letting God. The house of Israel called it manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded, and let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, in order that they may see the food with which I fed you in the wilderness, when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations." As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the covenant for safekeeping. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to a habitable land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. The word of the Lord. They ate manna for 40 years. This text takes place about a month after they had left Egypt. They had been on the road for roughly 30, 40 days. They had been freed from slavery for about a month. They had finally made it out of their incarceration. They had made it out of what they had struggled against for 400 years. God had displayed God's power in Egypt. We know the story. We know that Moses came and there were 10 plagues, and finally Pharaoh said, "Okay, you can go." And they didn't just leave, but the people gave them treasures and riches, and they gave them all that they needed and said, "Please, go. You are free." And we also know that Pharaoh changed his mind and came after them. But here we are in chapter 16 of Exodus. Here we are after all that God has done. And here in this chapter, though we read just the end part, in this chapter we see that the people of Israel were once again grumbling against the Lord. They were grumbling against what God could do. They were grumbling against Moses and Aaron because you led us out here for what? To die? Just 2 chapters ago, they stood before a sea with an army behind them. And instead of trusting, they said, "Were there not enough graves in Egypt? Couldn't you just leave us there to die?" They had somehow, in a short amount of time, already idealized Egypt. They had suffered for 400 years. They had gone through so many things in that time, and yet here, just a month after leaving for the second time, they're grumbling about how they are going to die in the wilderness. How you couldn't just leave us in Egypt to die. It's okay because slavery wasn't that bad. They suddenly start to idealize. And yet God, in God's eternal patience, God says, "I will provide." For now they were grumbling because they realized that for the amount of people that were traveling, the amount of food that they had wasn't sufficient for much longer. So they hadn't even gotten to the point of being hungry yet. They were anticipating being hungry. So it wasn't like they struggled and started to starve, like they lost children or older people because they didn't have enough food. They didn't even get to that point yet. They anticipated that they were going to run out of food in the near future and started grumbling already. And God, in God's infinite patience, instead of sending lightning, instead of getting rid of those who were grumbling, instead of pushing them out or saying, "What did I do taking these people out?" God, in God's eternal patience, says, I will provide. And he tells Moses that during the evening, I will provide meat, as quails will come and they will be caught and eaten by the people. And in the morning, every morning, there shall be something like flakes that will land on the ground that shall be collected and shall become the bread and the cake for them to eat. And manna is an awesome sounding name. It comes from the Hebrew word manhu, which means, what is it? And it's funny, my associate pastor growing up, she was the youth pastor. She told us that she was in a church group once, and they named themselves Manna because they thought it sounded awesome. And when people heard them play, they knew why they named them Manna, because people were like, what is it? They couldn't understand the music that they were playing. So here, the people are trying to understand what is going on. So God is providing for them. He is providing, what is it? He's providing that thing that they call a whatchamacallit or a who's-a-mabob. We don't know what it is, but if we collect it, then we can make cake and bread. And there are stories from ancient rabbis that state that the manna tasted whatever, whatever the person enjoyed the most is what the manna tasted like. If you were a child and loved sweets, it tasted like honey. If you were a man and loved meats, it tasted like meat. If you were an older person who loved soup, it tasted like chicken noodle soup. Okay, I added the chicken noodle, but you get the point. The ancient rabbis said that it became what each person needed so that they can enjoy and they can participate. So here we are with the people of Israel about to be supplied with manna, with manhu, or what is it? God provided for them. In the evenings, God was providing meat. In the morning, God was providing bread. But it wasn't just a provision, because we have to remember, God wasn't dropping this from the sky into their mouths. No, instead, they had to go out and work for it. Yes, God was providing the flakes to make the bread, but God wasn't saying to come out and open your mouth and say, to eat. Instead, they came out and gathered the flakes, each person as needed. So it was about a quart per person per household. So if you had 4 people, it was 4 quarts. And you should only get what you need, no more or less. Now there are people who you might imagine got a little greedy. Here, God said that each household would go out and collect what they needed for their household. God didn't say that you would have a central organization that would bring it all together and then disperse it individually. God didn't say that only the rich people can gather it, or only the rich people don't have to gather it, I should say, and they will send poor people to gather for them. No. Instead, each household went out and got as they needed. And those who were greedy found out why God said only take what you need. Because the next day, those flakes became filled with maggots and stench, and they were no good for the next day. But God wanted them to understand that God was providing for them. And he also wanted to teach them something. God wanted to teach them an important lesson, because though they only collected for one day every day, on the 6th day, they collected a double portion. So for every person in the household, instead of 1 quart, you would have 2 quarts. Because on the 7th day, that was an important day. That was a day that you rested. So you didn't go out and collect because there was going to be no manna for you to collect. But instead, God wanted to teach them about self-care. God was teaching them that though the journey was long, it was okay to take a moment of respite, Too often, we work and work and work and never take a break. And guess what? The work is still there, even when we've gone again and again and taken no breaks. But God calls us to take a moment of rest, to take a time of respite. Though it was hard, because they were on this journey. They were used to going out every morning. And those who went out on Sabbath morning realized that there was nothing to collect, for God had called them. And even with this, God is encouraging them to rest. And they still grumbled against God. God is telling them and showing them, you have 6 days to do all of your work. But the seventh day, your body needs rest. Your body needs a break. Your body needs to heal and regenerate so that you can go again for 6 days again. He's trying to teach them to rest in the midst of everything that needs to be done, but yet they still grumbled. They still were fighting with Moses and Aaron and in turn with God. Though God was trying to help them, to teach them a lesson, to help them to be better people, to be a people of healing, a people who, yes, get their work done, but also take a moment to enjoy the life that God has provided for them. But yet it seems almost in our nature, isn't it, to find something to grumble about. Here we have a people who were just freed from slavery. They worked and worked and worked. No breaks. And yet here God is giving them and teaching them to take a moment, a day of rest. And they still grumble against what God is trying to teach them. We grumble at many things. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a rhyme or reason. There's always something to grumble about. At church, there's always something to grumble about at church. Whether the pastor said or did, or the leadership did or said, the service was too short or too long, there's always something to grumble about. The hope is that we learn to be able to move beyond the moment of grumbling, because there's a lesson to be learned. God is teaching them a lesson in their grumbling. There's a lesson to be learned when we are grumbling, when we are complaining, when we see everything from a side of negativity. We should come out of that situation a little wiser, a little more mature, because we need to open up. We should be able to open up, to learn a little bit more, to be able to understand why we were grumbling at that moment. Sadly, for many of us, we grumble and then we don't learn. And then we grumble again and we don't learn again. But the truth is, if we don't learn from a situation, we will be back in that same situation one way or another. And we see that with the people of Israel here in just 3 chapters, from chapter 14 to 16 here. We saw them grumbling and complaining because there was a sea before them and an army behind them. And they saw that God opened the sea before them. God opened an ocean so that they could walk on dry ground. And here we are 2 chapters later. And what are they doing again? Grumbling. Why did you take us out? Why are you doing this? Why couldn't you leave us happy in Egypt? Because even though it was just a month, they were already idealizing how Egypt was, how good it was to them and for them. They didn't learn, even though they had suffered. They didn't learn, and they didn't trust enough. But here God was teaching them. Not only was God teaching them about the Sabbath rest, but here also God was teaching them how to trust in God for their daily provision. How hard would that be for you? if God provided for you every morning the food that you would eat that day, could you live like that? For many of us, if you open our cabinets, even those of us who are poor and broke, if you open our cabinets, you see tons of canned goods and foods and things that we won't necessarily eat until we have to. But we have them there. For those of us who say we have nothing to wear, if you open our closets, you have clothes from end to end. I have no shoes to wear, but yet you look in the closet and there are shoes from end to end. Could you live with God's daily provision? That's a hard thing to imagine, isn't it? Let's say every morning there was a bag of food on your doorstep, and that was your food for that day. How difficult would it be? Because I know the first thing we would say is, am I sure it will be there tomorrow? So maybe I shouldn't eat all my food today to make sure I have some for tomorrow. It would take trust. Here, these people were learning to live in trust. They trusted that every morning they would go out and find the flakes that made the cakes and bread. Every evening they went out trusting that there would be birds or quails there for them to eat for dinner. When we talk about God provides, it is a matter of learning how to trust God. It is a matter of learning that God is providing for us and with us. God is giving us what we need, yes. But do we have to store it in a big house like the man in the story of the New Testament, who gathered all of his grains and built bigger storage houses and said, tonight I'm going to drink and eat and be merry. And the angel of death came and said, you fool, tonight you will die, and no one will be able to enjoy the fruits of what you have taken. To trust, when we say that God provides, it means that we are believing and trusting that God will do just that. When I say God provides to you, what does it mean to you? What do you see? What do you hear? What comes to mind and what comes to your heart? Do you build that relationship, or do you have that trust relationship with God? Have you ever experienced God's provision in your life? Those moments when you thought that you would never get something, or the moment that you thought that you had no money or food and somebody or something came through. God's provision. Have you ever experienced God's provision in your life? And I want you to remember that moment, because all too often we experience that moment and then we move on and forget. But God continuously provides for us. Sometimes it's blatant like that. Sometimes it's not as open. But would you trust God to take care of you? Would you trust God enough to place all of your anxieties upon God? Would you trust God, or do you trust God enough to believe that though you may not have what you think you need, but that God will provide for all of your needs? Will you grumble like the people of Israel and idealize the situations past? Or will you move forward and trust and grow in faith, knowing that God is teaching, God is opening, God is speaking, God is helping us to grow and to mature? And there have been many moments in our lives that though we were between a rock and a hard place, that God opened a way for us. Are we willing to trust in that? Are we only willing to trust in the things that we see? If we can touch it, then it's real. But here you have the people of Israel who saw again and again the power of God. 10 plagues, freed from the greatest empire of the time. A sea opening before them. Manna coming when they needed food. Quails coming so they can eat meat. And yet they still struggle to trust God. What will our legacy be? What will your legacy be? Will it be a legacy of truly trusting God? Or will it be a legacy of believing at times, but then maybe not so much other times? Are you one who needs to see to believe? Jesus says in John 20:29, blessed are we who believe without seeing, because we can learn to grow in faith. Because it's not about seeing, it's not about touching, it's not about being real in the physical. It is about believing and trusting that God will provide, that God has provided, that God will continue to provide for each and every one of our needs in ways that we expect, and even greater in ways that we don't expect. God always provides. It takes us to believe and to trust that God will provide for us.